There is a deficiency quietly spreading through the bodies of adults over 60, one that affects the brain, the heart, the bones, the immune system, and the nervous system all at the same time. It doesn't show up on a routine blood panel unless your doctor specifically orders it. Most people who have it feel the symptoms every single day, but attribute them to aging. And the most alarming part? Research now suggests that in some countries, more than 40% of adults over 60 are significantly deficient in it, and the majority have no idea. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which vitamin this is, what it does inside every major system of the aging body, and why the standard advice about getting enough of it has been failing older adults for decades. We'll follow the biology step by step, from the first organ it affects to the hidden neurological consequences that take years to develop but are already accumulating silently right now. And there's one specific reason why people over 60 absorb dramatically less of this vitamin than younger adults, even when they eat the right foods. That reason changes everything about how this deficiency should be understood and addressed. Let's start with what this vitamin actually is, and why its story is more complicated than almost any other nutrient in human biology. The vitamin is B12, cobalamin. And before you think you already know this story, stay with us, because the way B12 actually works inside the aging body is not what most people have been told. And what happens when it runs low is not just tiredness or tingling in the fingers. It is a systematic biological unraveling that touches the brain, the spinal cord, the red blood cells, and the DNA repair machinery of every cell in the body simultaneously. Let's start from the very beginning, how B12 gets into your body. When you eat foods that contain B12, meat, fish, eggs, dairy, the B12 molecules are bound to protein. Your stomach must first release them using hydrochloric acid. This acid breaks apart the protein B12 bond, freeing the vitamin. Then, a specialized protein produced by cells in the stomach lining, called intrinsic factor, binds to the freed B12. This B12 intrinsic factor complex travels to the final section of the small intestine, called the ileum, where it is absorbed into the bloodstream. This is a multi-step process, and after the age of 60, two of those steps begin to break down. First, the stomach gradually produces less hydrochloric acid. This condition, called hypochlorhydria, is extremely common in older adults. Research suggests it affects between 10 and 30% of adults over 60 to varying degrees. Without sufficient stomach acid, the protein B12 bond cannot be properly broken. The vitamin moves through the digestive tract still attached to the food protein it arrived with, unavailable for absorption. You ate the B12. Your body can't access it. Second, the cells in the stomach lining that produce intrinsic factor can decline in number with age, and in some older adults, particularly those with a history of gastric inflammation, H. pylori infection, or autoimmune gastritis, intrinsic factor production drops significantly. Without intrinsic factor, even free B12 cannot be absorbed in the ileum. It passes through. Gone. This is why B12 deficiency after 60 is not primarily a dietary problem. It is an absorption problem. And this distinction is critical because it means that simply eating more B12-rich foods often doesn't fix it. The machinery to extract and use the vitamin is operating at reduced capacity. And almost no one explains this to older adults getting their routine checkups. But here's where it gets more serious, because what B12 does inside the body once it is properly absorbed is extraordinary. Every single cell in the human body requires B12 for two fundamental processes: DNA synthesis and myelin production. DNA synthesis is exactly what it sounds like, the ability of cells to copy their genetic code accurately when they divide. Myelin is the protective sheath that wraps around nerve fibers, the way plastic insulation wraps around electrical wires. Without adequate myelin, nerve signals cannot travel accurately. They slow down, they misfire, they weaken. When B12 levels fall, both of these processes are compromised throughout the entire body, in every tissue at the same time. The cells that feel this first are the fastest dividing ones, the red blood cells produced in the bone marrow. Without adequate B12, red blood cells cannot divide and mature properly. Instead, they become large, malformed, and dysfunctional, a condition called megaloblastic anemia. These cells cannot carry oxygen efficiently. The result? Fatigue, weakness, shortness of breath, and pallor. Not because the heart or lungs are failing, but because the blood itself is delivering less oxygen to every tissue in the body. And here is what makes this deficiency particularly insidious in older adults. It builds gradually. B12 is stored in the liver, and those stores can last 2 to 5 years even when absorption has been compromised. This means the deficiency can be developing silently for years before symptoms appear. By the time fatigue and weakness are noticed, neurological damage may already be underway. Because here's where the biology becomes genuinely alarming. The nervous system is acutely dependent on B12 for myelin maintenance. The longest nerve fibers in the body, particularly the ones running through the spinal cord, are most vulnerable. When B12 levels drop below a critical threshold, myelin begins to degrade. Nerve signal transmission slows. In early deficiency, this shows up as tingling or numbness in the hands and feet, symptoms so commonly attributed to general aging or poor circulation that they are routinely dismissed. But these sensations are often the nervous system sending its first distress signal. Left unaddressed, the myelin damage progresses. Research documents a condition called subacute combined degeneration of the spinal cord, where the nerve tracts governing both movement and sensation in the limbs are structurally damaged. Balance deteriorates. Gait becomes unstable. Fine motor control diminishes. And in severe cases, the damage is irreversible. Because once myelin is destroyed beyond a threshold, regeneration is limited. But the brain does not escape this. Not at all. B12 is required for the metabolism of homocysteine, an amino acid produced naturally during normal cellular metabolism. In the presence of adequate B12, homocysteine is converted to methionine, a harmless and useful compound. When B12 is deficient, homocysteine accumulates in the blood, and elevated homocysteine is one of the most consistently documented risk factors for cognitive decline, brain atrophy, and cerebrovascular damage in aging adults. Research published in Neurology and Geriatric Medicine journals has found that older adults with low B12 levels show significantly accelerated brain volume loss compared to those with normal levels. The hippocampus, the brain's memory hub, is particularly affected. Multiple studies have linked elevated homocysteine and low B12 to increased risk of Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. This is not fringe science. It is consistent, replicated, and increasingly prominent in mainstream geriatric medicine. Now here is what the research points toward in terms of addressing this, and why the answer isn't straightforward. Because B12 absorption in older adults is compromised at the stomach acid and intrinsic factor level, standard dietary intake of B12-rich foods is often insufficient to correct established deficiency. However, there is a form of B12 absorption that bypasses this entire system: passive diffusion. At very high doses of supplemental B12, in the range of 500 to 1,000 micrograms, a small percentage, roughly 1 to 2%, is absorbed directly across the gut lining without requiring intrinsic factor or stomach acid. This passive diffusion pathway can be sufficient to maintain or restore B12 status in people with impaired active absorption. For more severe cases, particularly those involving significant intrinsic factor deficiency or frank neurological symptoms, intramuscular B12 injections bypass the gut entirely and are the standard medical treatment. This is a clinical decision requiring a doctor's involvement. The key point the research makes clearly is this: adults over 60 should not wait for obvious symptoms to investigate their B12 status. By the time the classic signs appear, the fatigue, the numbness, the cognitive changes, significant deficiency has typically been present for months or years. A simple blood test measuring serum B12 and ideally methylmalonic acid, a more sensitive marker of functional B12 status, provides a far earlier picture of where things stand. Of course, supplementation decisions, underlying conditions, and the role of medications, particularly metformin and proton pump inhibitors, both of which reduce B12 absorption, should all be discussed with a qualified physician. This is biology. Every person's situation is different, but here is what the science has been trying to say, loudly, for years. B12 deficiency after 60 is not rare, it is not obvious, and it is not simply fixed by eating more steak. It is a structural biological problem driven by the aging digestive system, one that silently attacks the blood, the nerves, the spinal cord, and the brain over years, while wearing the mask of ordinary tiredness and the assumption of normal aging. The symptoms you've been told are just getting older. The fatigue, the forgetfulness, the unsteady balance, the tingling feet may not be age at all. They may be a system running low on something it cannot absorb the way it once could. So here is the question that deserves a real answer. If a simple blood test could tell you whether your brain and nervous system have been running on empty for years, what would you be waiting for?